it sounds stupid and silly, but it actually works. This is you hear something over and over. It sounds familiar. It must be true. This is how human beings learn. So this is why repetition is very, very important. And that's also why in the beginning I point out in the book that this one claim, this was unprovoked. This is a very key phrase. No, yeah, but of course it doesn't have to be substantiated anytime. Of course, it was very much provoked. Again, it's quite evident, not just with NATO expansion, the toppling of the government in Ukraine, the supports of the right wing's influence in Ukraine, the modernizing the ports in Ukraine to accommodate the American British warships, all the arms coming in at the same time as you're announcing, we're going to take back Crimea. Of course, there was a war coming.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I have again the pleasure of talking to Glenn Diesen, who is a professor at the University of Southeast Norway and an associate editor at the journal Russia in Global Affairs. Many of you certainly know him from his work with the YouTube channel The Duran, where he has been conducting numerous wonderful interviews alongside Alexander Mercouris. Glenn recently wrote a new book that just came out today or yesterday on the Ukraine war and the Eurasian World Order. Well, that's what we want to discuss today and tease to you in order for you to know what the book is about, because I do think it is highly timely. Couldn't be much better, because Glenn talks about nothing less than the collapse of the current order that we all are experiencing. So Glenn, thank you very much for coming online.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to promote my book as well. So
always happy. Good books need to be promoted because they need to be read. That's the only way how we can potentially get out of this absolute horrible situation where we just talked about it before. This talk, we get on a daily basis, we get insulted because the things that we are fed in the media is the opposite of what's actually happening in the world. We are being told that Israel is defending itself when it's committing a genocide. In Gaza, we are told in Ukraine that the West is supporting the freedom and order and blah, 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 when in fact what we are seeing is a very horrible hegemonic war. And you write about this. So can we maybe focus on what's the core thesis of your book?
To understand why all countries are willing to effectively take such huge risks, and even at the brink of a possible nuclear war, we're willing to do all of this. It's because this has become a war largely about world order, and I find this to be interesting because it's something that appears to be a consensus about on all sides. You hear it from the Polish leadership, you hear it from the EU leadership, the Americans. They're all referring to this more or less as a break in the world order, because after the Cold War we had this unipolar order with one center of power, which is the US, and leading the collective West. And it was based on what we call the rules-based international order, which is a topic of its own. But now, of course, it's already come to an end. And the idea for the Western side is, if we can just break Russia here, we can revive some of this unipolar idea in Europe. We can, further expand NATO. The Russians will, be on their last leg, but also it will weaken China, because this is the main ally of the Chinese. So it seemed as a last chance to restore unipolarity. But of course, if it didn't work since the 90s, when all power was concentrated in the West, common sense would dictate it's not going to happen. But on the other side, you see countries like Russia, China, others pushing for a multipolar system. And if you want the answer why the rest of the world, that is the world outside NATO, doesn't support NATO sanctions against Russia or sending weapons or any of this, it's not because they support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The rest of the world made it very clear they don't do this, but they also don't support NATO's war on Russia, well, a proxy war. And the general idea would be, it would be horrible if NATO would be able to break Russia. Imagine how intolerable the West would be in the years to come. Attempting to restore this one central power. They want multipolarity. So this is why I thought, discussing this point in history in terms of shifting world order was quite reasonable.
Yeah, and I think your book connects the Ukraine war as a linchpin of a change in the way world order works. And you actually have a chapter on world order and what it means, or I think at least a good part in the at some point to understand like how are we supposed to make sense of order? Because this is also something the West talks about a lot, right? That it just upholds order and the rules-based order, right? When in fact what we are seeing is just a grabbing on to power in a way that is utterly unrealistic and very counterproductive, and does so through war. Through the opposite of what they're professing. So you start with the introduction, then you go into the modern Westphalian world order. The third chapter then is the rise of the Western centric world order, where you go through the history of especially Westphalia. You go through the Pax Americana and liberal hegemony, as you call it very befittingly. Then the decline of the West and the liberal world order. You go through NATO expansion and the collapse of the pan-European order, Ukraine as a pawn in the divided Europe, and the Ukraine civil war, 2014 to 2022, as you call it, the Russian invasion of 2022, and then Eurasian Westphalian world order, which is kind of the synthesis, I believe, because what you're seeing, what you're saying, what's emerging is a new way. A Eurasian way of doing things. Can we maybe first focus on what the Westphalian world order was and why you're thinking the change that's coming is actually one that is bigger than just the last 30 years? It's bigger than the last 500 years.
Well, the second chapter there is on the theory of world order, what it is. Ironically, we did once a podcast with Chas Freeman, and it was about world order, and we got what it was called community note a bit beneath saying, well, world order is a conspiracy theory, which is very weird because it is a concept in international relations. Anyways, world order largely reflects are the rules about how states interact with each other, how not just states, but the rules of the game, if you will. And typically it depends on, well, it's influenced by two things. One would be the international distribution of power, and second would be the legitimacy. So, for example, after the Cold War, there was one central power, and the United States largely legitimized ruling the world, leaning on liberal ideals, in which human rights, democracy would allow it to reduce the sovereignty of other states, or take it from a right to a responsibilities, if you will. Anyways, well, we always had this bit of a shift between either hegemonic states or going back essentially to the Roman Empire, or a balance of power. Now, what it's usually said that the modern world order began with the Peace of Westphalia, which occurred after the 30-year war. So in 1648. So at this point, we realized no one power could restore hegemony in Europe. Simply, there was no universal values really anymore because of the Reformation. There was no ability to organize under one flag. So the world order from that point in time was based on a balance of power. So you had many centers of power. If any one of them aspired to try to seek hegemony or dominance, then the others would collectively balance. And this also accommodated for distinctive values and ideas. So this is this was then the foundation of the modern world order, and this was of course the European order, but today it became a world order. Now I can go through the history of how at certain times we've had states who try to revive the era of Pax Romana, when you had this period in the Roman Empire with one central power, which brought prosperity and stability, peace, all of this. So this was it's always been positive ideals to aspire to in order to overthrow this balance of power. But this has kind of been the main international system we have been organized around until, of course, the end of the Cold War, in which we began to dismiss this idea. Well, we don't need a balance of power. If we have one center in the United States, it actually will help us to overcome the international anarchy, because great powers won't fight among each other anymore. Now we'll have peace, and also it's based on universal values, liberal ideals, which will, elevate human freedoms. But so it's a lovely idea, but I also go through the Cold War, where you see people like Kennedy warning, listen, we're not going to try to establish some Pax Americana. This is not our goal, because it goes without saying, if you try to, that distribution of legitimacy would not work. The distribution of power depends on holding down other rising powers. You can't allow, the Russians, Chinese, others to rise independently from you, because then it would be an independent pole of power. Also, the liberal ideals, which, the world seemed to be very optimistic about in the 90s, it all becomes weaponized, because it means sovereignty for us, but not for you. And which effectively summarizes this, rules-based international order, which has been attempted to replace international law. So I think that, that's probably the best way of understanding it, if you look at the power distribution and the legitimacy for wielding the power.
Yeah, in this sense, what you wrote is very much along the lines of the realist tradition of power centers, and also a change in these powers and the ups and downs. But what you're also doing brilliantly is actually connecting the dots with the current narrative, let's say, that is built around hegemonic dominance, right? What we are seeing is the US and the West trying to dominate everybody else, and doing so under an incredibly intellect insulting narrative of doing the opposite, of freeing everybody, trying to free people from the evil yoke of the Russians and from Chinese suppression and Palestinian terrorism, right? This is what hurts so much. And let me quote one part of your introduction, which I think summarizes this well. Liberal hegemony glorifies the dominance of one center of power, which is reflected in the narrative that has collapsed. It is suggested that NATO is merely a third party seeking to defend the Westphalian principle of national sovereignty against unprovoked Russian aggression. Yet, the Ukraine war was the direct consequence of the West's effort to undermine the Westphalian world order, to advance the hegemonic world order. Can you maybe explain this a little bit further?
Well, I think that what that points as well is the relevance of propaganda, because if you're going to have like a liberal empire or a liberal hegemony, you will have a lot of these contradictions popping up. And it's important to note that at the core of propaganda is, you want to strip the world of all its complexity, and instead impose this very simplistic heuristics where they divide the world into good versus evil. Now, for us in the West, there's always, historically been civilization versus barbarians, but in the modern time, it's recast as democracy versus authoritarianism. Of course, it is an aspect, but it does make sense to simplify all conflicts through this prism. But it is quite effective, and you said it was an insult to our intellect, and that's because you give this stereotype. Well, all the world's empirical facts has to be translated through this, and suddenly it doesn't necessarily make much sense. But of course, Walter Lippmann pointed out in his days that human beings are, if you challenge their basic worldview, they experience great discomfort. They will go to great lengths to ignore it, facts which don't fit the narrative. So, so the government just have to arm its public. I mean, I talk to people about, what's happening in Ukraine and all that, and you notice they have the empty catchphrases. It's propaganda, it's conspiracy theory, it's anti-American, it's anti-Western, it's anti-Ukrainian. So again, there's no substance. Yes. No one's contesting the facts. It's just that they have locked into this one idea. So this allows us to do a lot of things. So again, in Ukraine, we toppled the government in 2014. We called it a democratic revolution, even though nobody knew, the majority did not support this coup in Ukraine. The majority didn't even support the Maidan revolt. And we, as you said, we want to liberate the Ukrainians. But from 91 to 2014, every poll, Ukrainian and foreign, has shown the same thing. The majority, only about 20% actually wanted to join NATO. If the majority had to choose, well, what would they choose? They would probably go with Russia instead. So it's kind of based on this in ideology instead of an actual reality. And we saw the same if you remember back in 2019 when it was it 73% of or 72% of Ukrainians, they voted for Zelensky's peace platform. You had a few nationalists saying, "Oh, this is a surrender," and then of course the Americans repeated the same thing. So we're going to help the Ukrainians not to have to surrender to Russia by engaging in peace negotiations. So we support the nationalists so we can effectively cancel that whole peace platform. So it's a lot of these examples going through and through where we keep seeing over and over again that we're always going to help Ukraine, we're going to bring democracy and freedom, but at the end of the day we're doing always the opposite. And again, always stuck with the narrative. It's the facts no longer support it, and that's why it's so important now to have proper propaganda as well, because we have to have our catchphrases out, because again, there's no solid ground under our feet anymore.
Yeah, the propaganda and also the propaganda narrative really hollows out the substance of what an actually intelligent discussion about the whole thing should be, and reduces it to catchphrases, as you absolutely correctly say. The fascinating thing to me, though, is that we see now parallels in the West emerge to where the Soviet Union used to stand in the 70s and 80s. And actually, Jack Matlock just published a wonderful piece on that one. And I'm gonna, if everything works tomorrow, I will be talking to him and he will read that. And he's, of course, the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union. And he starts to seeing parallels of how the West is now using what he calls the Brezhnev doctrine on all other countries, as in saying anything that's not going according to our own doctrine is evil, and we will use military might if necessary to overthrow it, the way the Soviet Union did in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. Now, this also has something still to do with world order. The West believes that liberalism and its version of that is the only legitimate form of order, right? Can you maybe expand a little bit on that, how you see it tying in with the Westphalian system that you think has first collapsed, or that the West is working towards collapsing and is actually going to be re-emerging?
Well, first with liberalism, I think many would argue that the ideals of liberalism are, well, they're pretty great, so putting the individual first. But the problem is with any values which is based around universalism, it allows one country to effectively impose or challenge the legitimacy or the sovereignty of another state. And this is why you see, for example, the Chinese rejecting very heavily all these universalist claims, because they keep saying, "Oh, all states are different. We have our own path." Well, what they're saying is, we're not going to let your universal ideals be used as a way to undermine our sovereignty or interfere in our domestic affairs. But overall, I think there's a lot of similarities between what's happening now and the British call for liberal hegemony, and in the 19th century. Effectively, you have to sell this idea that yes, as long as the British or now the Americans are dominant, then liberal values will thrive, and this is what's going to elevate humankind. But then you have these contradictions appearing, and again, also not unlike the Soviets, when the ideology didn't support realities on the ground anymore. That's when you kind of have to start to live in this parallel universe which we create for ourselves with these alternative facts. So I think that that would be the main challenge which we have now. Sorry, I forgot the beginning of the question again.
Sorry, maybe the beginning was that I should ask shorter questions, but the liberal, the aspect of making this an ideology, right? This the idea of a liberal world, which is, as you say, is
Oh,
a
yeah,
good idea,
definitely.
but you make it into an ideology that becomes then self-reinforcing and it starts to entrench itself.
Yeah, so well, that's the problem. Liberalism has been become a hegemonic ideology. That is, if you believe in, values of freedom and human progress, then you have to accept the leadership and dominance of the West. This was also a problem in the 90s when we decided to begin to expand NATO, because we effectively told we conflated NATO expansion with democratization. So we essentially told the Russians, either you have to accept that this is the spread of civilization, democracy, or if you oppose NATO expansion, then you're rejecting democracy. That means now you have to be contained. So either way, what we effectively told the Russians, we're going to expand this military bloc to your borders. If you support it, great, we're going to move NATO to your borders. If you don't support it, well, that means you hate democracy, and now we really have to put NATO on your doorstep because now you have to be contained. So we kind of go with this dual narrative the whole time. On one hand, it's not aimed against you unless you reject us and democracy, and that we are a force for good, and then we will use it against you. And so I think this is the main problem. We have had a whole generation of politicians for, again, since the early 1990s. It's been more than 30 years now. They all grown up in this idea of, more or less the end of history. We're going to have no more great power wars. We're just going to have the leadership, perpetual leadership of the West, which is legitimized under liberal democratic values. And no one will contest this leadership. And then suddenly now you have this transition to multipolarity, and we don't know how to deal with it. We have to create new enemy images. For example, look at China now. China's rising. How are we going to deal with this? Yes, I know we can refer to them as being communist. They're not real communists, but they're not properly democratic. They have industrial policies which might not be fair. But none of this really explains this hostility. There's not much, even if China was a flourishing democracy, the Americans would not allow them to take over, to become the dominant well, not dominant, but a leading state in the world. So they're not capable of adjusting to multipolarity. You have this new distribution of power, and there's it doesn't fit within liberal hegemony. So it's a system which is not very adaptable to change, and this is the main problem.
Yeah, and for anyone doubting what you're saying, just look at what the United States did rhetorically to Japan in the 1980s when Japan was about to overtake the United States economically. I mean, the similarities to the China bashing are huge, but that's only one. I would rather ask you about another aspect.
And that was an ally.
Yeah,
yeah. That's very
yeah.
And look what they did. Yeah.
No, the top dog does not tolerate any other dogs on the same level. They need to be one or two down, and they're willing to take the beating. If they're not willing to take the beating is going to get harder. Just look at what happened to the German dog once it thought it's going to have a pipeline with Russia. So, and you have to take it. Even like in representation, like you cannot have anyone really stand up to the top dog. But the one phenomenon that we have and that we need to make sense of is that it is true that in the Western liberal order, there is a lot of countries that are very cozy with that. The Japanese are happy. The Japanese also, and the South Koreans and so on. And the threat coming from China I think, is not enough to explain why they do that and go along with it. And even more, we saw the collapse of basically of three neutral states because of the Ukraine war. And Ukraine itself used to be neutral and was on the way back to neutrality, and then it didn't happen. And Finland and Sweden, they both are happy to give it up. And actually, a majority of people, they are support now joining that NATO force and giving up a security strategy that kept them in the balance of power at a beautifully peaceful and prosperous place. That, to me, is irrational, but it must be explainable through ideology. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, no, well, that was Finland and Sweden, but in this country, in Norway, it's a similar problem. Of course, we were part of NATO from the beginning, but the problem here was we always tried to find a balance between deterrence and reassurance. So we didn't let the British and Americans go too far up in our northern areas. We didn't accept any military bases on our soil. So like NATO light. So, still have security guarantees, but without provoking the Soviets and then Russia. But we also abandoned this. Now we're opening an abundance of American military bases. Of course, we're not allowed to call them military bases because we're not allowed to have military base on our soil. So we call them, I forgot the English word for it. It's just the defined territories, or we just came up with new words. It's a bit like the Americans. They don't do torture, so they call it an advanced interrogation techniques. It's just and this is very common when you don't have an argument, you just change the language instead. But anyway, so the problem for Scandinavia then is no one in Finland thinks that the Russians were going to invade them, but again, this is it's a situation of panic, and people are just fueled with one narrative, and a lot of the facts, which I also outlined in the book, they shouldn't be controversial. They are very clear, objective facts. They're confirmed by both sides. You can go, on the Ukrainian government website and read it, and still, it will not penetrate or disturb with our narrative. So, I think that this. This has helped to change as a lot of countries, again, not just Scandinavia, which has been very like a region of peace throughout the Cold War, but we also see now with Austria, for example, or even Switzerland, like we don't really have any neutral countries. For people like you who study, your main focus is neutrality studies, it's all over. And this, I agree, there hasn't been any rational debate around this. Some of it, I think, has been very calculated because the Finns and the Swedes always were opposed to, or the public were opposed to NATO expansion. But once, the Russians invaded, the hysteria grows. I think there was a rush to bring them in quickly because, it's easy to join, but it's very difficult to leave in the long run. So no, it's a great shame, and I keep looking for the rational debates around it. So if you don't think Russia's going to attack you, Finland, why did you convert from a greater success story of neutrality to being the main front line against the Russians? And what you see in the media is always, it sounds like spite is the main argument. Well, Putin didn't want any NATO on his border. Look how much NATO he will get now. I mean, it's just. This is not an argument which, you want your adversaries to feel safe. If they feel threatened, they will act in, the way they're doing now. So even the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, he made this argument, the Russians invaded Ukraine because they didn't want NATO on their border. Now look at us. We're rolling into Finland and Sweden. And so why is this good for us? This is not... we always assume power maximization is the same as security maximization, but if you roll up on the Russian border like this, you're going to be less safe. It's like China and Russia opening up military bases in Mexico. It's not going to make them more safe. It's just going to make the Americans then more nervous, and they're going to have to take more aggressive steps. So it's no, that's why I think this obviously the unipolarity has come to an end, and many had hoped it would be that the multipolar order would be negotiated, but instead we see that it's still coming, but it will come through war and conflict, which is great shame for everyone.
Yes, it is. It is. Unless this ideological brain cancer that is spreading in Europe and North America, unless that stops and people come back to a rational discussion about how to organize world politics, there will be more war. This is utterly clear. But the thing is that we are seeing different forms of ideology. And so, can you tell me, what was the cutoff for your book? When did you stop writing?
When was that? I think it was December somewhere.
December.
November.
November,
But,
okay, because this is always important for books about current affairs, like where did you have to make the cutoff, because it's then published later, right? But and one thing that happened in early February, of course, is the interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, which is such an insult to the West, not because Vladimir Putin said anything new, but because for the first time it was listened to properly listened to by a Western audience, like piercing the narrative a little bit, right? Just a little bit. But Tucker Carlson also displays that he is one of the people who would like to have peace with Russia in order to go to war with China. Which is still a form of this same imperial mindset. Do you see it the same way, or do you see that? Did you also interpret it that way?
Yeah, no, well, obviously this is this is the problem. It's often what they're arguing, the freedom you have to choose there in the US is, between Pepsi and Coke, McDonald's or Burger King. Do you want war with Russia or war with China? It is no one is really asking for a fundamentally different foreign policy, or having a discussion about America's place in the world, because yeah, as I outlined in my book, in the early 90s, there was a discussion, are we gonna create a Europe, for example, with the Russians, which would imply multipolarity, which we actually agreed to, or we're gonna expand NATO, which would be manifestation of hegemony, in which there's only one center that can dominate. And we had this discussion, but now, of course, 30 years later, we can see that this project isn't working. It's collapsing. The whole world more or less rejects it. And even if we would want to keep it, the realities show that we have a multipolar distribution of power. Anyways, so what I would expect from Tucker Carlson, others, more of a broader debate, like what is the best role of the United States in the world? Does it make sense to take a step back, resolve your economic, social, political problems, or we're gonna fight this till the end? Because at the moment, the looks like they're going to go to war with Russia, or they are fighting a proxy war with Russia, going to war with Iran, planning a war with China. Obviously, this is not the liberal hegemony they spoke about in the 90s. So I thought something was missing there from. It's sad that Tucker Carlson's view of the world is as good as it gets, but at the moment, I don't see any other. Broader debates about America's, adjusting to a new position in the world. But I was a bit horrified by the responses across the West, both the political class and the media, the way they rejected it, denounced it as propaganda before the interview was even released. This idea that only listening to the other side, hearing their argument, you don't have to buy into it, but you hear their argument, that this is something dangerous, we should not do this. I mean, in this country, I think was the prime minister, he said, the interview was just nonsense. He hadn't actually watched it, but he read it somewhere. So it's just this very obscene way of dealing with this fear of having your public exposed merely to the argument of this other side, which is frightening, because at least during the Cold War, we could know what the argument of Moscow was. We're not allowed to do it anymore. And again, everything is propaganda. They don't discuss the substance of it. Never.
No, but it was the opposite in the Cold War. In the Cold War, the citizens of the Soviet Union weren't really allowed to engage with the arguments of Western Europe, or had a big problems in getting that information, which is why the West decided to do this Radio Free Europe and such propaganda station to get a little some stuff across, and both have these engagements. But the point about multipolarity is that once a system becomes multipolar, it doesn't matter whether or not one side buys into it. It's force that backs it up, right? And the fact that one side cannot impose itself. And what we're seeing right now is that the West is losing the ability to impose itself economically, militarily, and so on the rest of the world, and keep exploiting, especially also China and Russia, the way Russia was looted in the 1990s. That is not happening anymore. How do you think that this change in power distribution, do you think it will necessarily lead to a great war? Because it seems that the NATO is not willing to send its own troops. Do you think that might change?
It depends. I think the plan was to fight Russia with Ukrainians.
To the last Ukrainian,
yeah, to the last Ukrainian. I mean, again, this was also considered conspiracy and Russian propaganda. But it was only very recently, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he went to the United States trying to sell continuing the war. And he said the same thing. Listen, this is a very cheap deal. You get to, weaken Russia, kill Russians, and it's even good for your arms industry. Like, you have to continue this. So no one's even pretending anymore that this is something else. Oh, sorry, my thought went in a different path. What was the question again?
The hard power that China and Russia have to
Sorry.
back up the multipolarity, and also Iran. Is war inevitable, or do you see factors at play that could still keep it below Third World War level?
Well, sorry, I remember where I was going with this. Well, obviously the ideal was to fight Russia with Ukrainians, but the running out of manpower, that's one of the key weaknesses now in the Ukrainian army. They're sending now women and old people into the trenches, and also younger ones. So that's a big question. What happens once NATO begins to lose this war with Ukrainians? Then we can either go, let Ukraine fail, or begin to send in our own troops. And it is, so far, I think there's some pushing in both directions. I don't see the Americans having any appetite for sending their troops. The British, of course, are always, they tend to overestimate their own capabilities. I don't think they have that many soldiers, but still, they have more optimism about this idea of possibly sending their own troops. I am hoping that common sense will start to move forward. But I don't think we would, when you see the huge amount of casualties, I don't think we would do that to our own soldiers. I think it's very easy to fight with with Ukrainians, but I don't think we would do that with our own. But it goes beyond the multipolar reality, as you said. You can pretend as if it's not here, but you end up fooling yourself. You mentioned, look at the sanctions on China, where they're trying to cut them off from this, we're not going to supply in more chips. Now their economy will collapse. No, a few weeks later, it seems they have their own homemade chips. So you can't really do this, same as the Europeans. So we're going to put huge sanctions on Russia. Now they will collapse. Yes, in a multipolar world, now unipolar world, it would work. If there's one center of power, the West, we cut them off from our technologies. We're not going to buy their gas anymore, their oil. Well, of course, then they will collapse. But what do we see now? There's other centers of power. So they're simply now exporting their energy to the East. And if they want to buy anything, they go to the East or to Greater Eurasia. So what do we see? In a multipolar system, when you sanction someone, you end up often isolating yourself because you cut yourself off from this market. And look at the Europeans. No more access to cheap energy, and also no export market, a huge export market. So the European economies are now deindustrializing. Meanwhile, the Russian economy has become the largest in Europe. So things are not going as planned. And so I think these are the multipolar realities, which is it will take us some time to get used to, because keep in mind that since the early 1500s, the world became more and more Western centric during the age of exploration, when it went to all the different corners of the world, and especially since the 1800s, with after the Industrial Revolution, especially breaking China in the mid 19th century, a lot of these things have put Western dominance, as the center of the international order, but of a world order. But it's all coming very quickly to an end, but we keep living in denial, thinking this is the patriotic thing to do. Just pretend as if it's still the 1990s.
Yeah. But the thing is, I think it works less and less well. And there are a couple of elements within the system that this liberal order itself built that I do think work against the logic of war. The logic of war is such that it needs to make sure that both sides start hating each other so much that they're willing to really even sacrifice themselves in order to get what they want, right? And if that logic, if that escalation starts happening, then it gets horrible. But what we see is that the Russians and the Chinese are actually both trying to de-escalate. And what we are seeing is within the West that we still are able to talk here on YouTube, you and I, and to distribute to not a huge, but still a sufficient a good number of people, and also like other channels, we're still able to talk. I do think this might come to an end if the logic of war starts winning over here. This will vanish probably, but we also still see that we do have democratic movements, right? I mean, even if it's the nationalistic one, like Marine Le Pen and so on, who are saying like we shouldn't go to war with China and so on, with Russia, even if they want to go to war with China. But we have counter movements that still might be able to influence the West and tone things down. How much hope do you have into these domestic factors?
Well, I think if you look at the trust in the media, how it's collapsing, I think it suggests that this can't go on forever. And again, it's often just treated as something negative. But the reason why people don't trust the media is because it's not trustworthy. Yeah, they lie a lot, and
themselves.
Also, yeah, well, that's the worst. When you believe your own propaganda, that's when things go really bad. So I think I'm somewhat optimistic that things can change as the lies become more and more evident. And this also impacts, for example, how he wrote a book, because as you might have seen in the book, a whole chapter I just have to show that NATO expansion was about Russia, because this is somehow overnight become a controversial thing, even though you have all these ambassadors, all these foreign ministers, CIA directors, all of them confirming, you had Senate debates. Should we expand NATO in the 90s? Yeah, we have to have an insurance policy against those Russians. They spoke very openly about this, but now no media will, it's treated as Russian propaganda. So it took a whole 9,000 words just to present facts. So that's maybe something you notice in the book. You have to really present a lot of evidence, because the narrative has become so strong. But also it gives reason to think that people can be persuaded if you put forward enough evidence and show how shallow those ideological slogans have become. Because for example, in the book I also discuss on when Russia invaded, it's become now, everyone said no, they were trying to conquer all of Europe, even though the Russians said no, we're just going to use the military force to impose a preferable peace agreement, given that the West sabotaged Minsk agreement for 7 years. Now you can have all the people who negotiated Minsk agreement, the French, the Germans, they've already come out and admitted that yes, they weren't going to implement it, but it doesn't come in the media picture. But also this invasion, that Russia was going to conquer all of Ukraine, and that when they didn't, this was a sign of weakness, a reason why we have to fight them. As I show in the book, it shows Zelensky from the first day of the war, the day after Russia invaded, on the 25th of February. He confirms, listen, Moscow contacted us today, again, the day after they invaded. They still want to talk. They want neutrality for us. That's the main thing. And if we get this, it's all good. And then they say, yes, we can discuss this. Neutrality is acceptable. Let's sit down and talk. So they agree to start negotiation on the third day after the Russian invasion. And then, of course, at the same time, you see the American spokespeople saying the exact opposite. They say, no, there will be no negotiations without preconditions. First, they have to withdraw. So then you see immediately the sabotage coming. And the head of Zelensky's own party now, what's his name? David
Rakhmonov, something like that. Yeah, he said that. He said Boris Johnson came over and we stopped. Yeah.
Yeah, he confirmed. The main mediators, the Turkish foreign minister, Israeli prime minister, they confirmed, yes, the US and British wanted to sabotage this because they had an opportunity to kill Russians with Ukrainians. You had even top American officials, confirming that this had happened. So it's just amazing that all sides, the negotiators, the Ukrainians, the Russians, you have German top military leaders, you have everyone agreeing on the same thing. Yes, of course, there was a peace agreement in place. Russia only wanted one thing, really, that was neutrality, no NATO expansion. And still, open up any Western newspaper and this is nothing to do about NATO. You can't negotiate with the Russians. So the narrative has divorced itself so far from facts that I think if people start to just, see some of these undisputable facts, you can't really buy into the narrative anymore. The extent of delusion goes too far.
The structural problem that we have who actually cling to facts and to peaceful interaction and sanity is that it takes 9,000 words in order to convince one person of a couple of facts. But if you repeat the same line 9,000 times, you can convince 500 million people just by sheer fact that it was repeated everywhere, and then it becomes reality, right? And politics is the art of shaping the current 6 weeks. And the West is really good at that. Really, really good. Like we must say that I think no hegemonic regime has ever been able to capture its own population for this long, this tightly, and make them believe their lies that like thoroughly. So that's why it's so difficult for us to actually write against this.
Well, this is political propaganda. It exploits some weaknesses in mankind, and one of them is the way the way we learn through experiences. We have a proclivity to confuse what seems familiar, with what is true. So if you just repeat something many times, which is Trump is good at this. He always says, the same China, this is, and the thing is, it sounds stupid and silly, but it actually works. This is, you hear something over and over, it sounds familiar, it must be true. This is how, human beings learn. So this is why repetition is very, very important. And that's also why in the beginning I point out in the book that this one claim, this was unprovoked. This is a very key phrase. Now, yeah, but of course it doesn't have to be substantiated anytime. Of course, it was very much provoked. Again, it's quite evident not just with NATO expansion, the toppling of the government in Ukraine, the supports of the right wing's influence in Ukraine, the modernizing the ports in Ukraine to accommodate the American British warships, all the arms coming in at the same time as you're announcing, we're going to take back Crimea. Of course, there was a war coming, but again, you just repeat the same thing over and over again, and people believe that it's well, it can't be true. Then it must be fake. It's Russian propaganda, and it's very depressing to see. But as you say, it's we become very, very effective. We become very good at this kind of a way of mobilizing the public towards one idea to spread one narrative. So it's reason for pessimism, but at the same time, I think that the narrative can be cracked.
Unless this liberal hegemony, or the hegemony of the powers in Washington, London, and so on, and the second and third tier, unless they succeed in switching off, also what made liberalism cool in the beginning, like the freedom to move and freedom to exchange and so on, and protest, which some people are working on. Unless they switch that off completely and keep the dominance, it will probably not entirely work, because there's still a good thinking part of the population. And if they manage to switch it off, it will lose all of its appeal. So either way, I think this system is doomed.
Yeah, because, well, the whole sales pitch of a liberal hegemony in the 90s was this will be, the end of history. This will be the perpetual peace, because one center of power, there won't be rivalry between the great powers. And of course, liberal democratic values first. We have openness, freedoms. This will also have a mitigating effect on the international system to reduce conflicts. So it's a great pitch, but see where we are now. You have the head of NATO constantly saying, "Oh, weapons are the path to peace." The EU, this was supposed to be a whole new form of politics, a civilian power, we're told. Now they're all saying, well, this conflict has to be solved on the battlefield. I mean, what is this? Is for those who study the EU in the 2000s when they were supposed to be normative power, civilian power. This is something very different. And again, the people who, in the name of liberalism, they're calling for increasing censorship, more war, no diplomacy. I mean, it's just they're not delivering, if you will, on the promise of what liberal hegemony was supposed to be all about. And I think you're correct. I think all the liberal pretenses has to be abandoned, and that's just the political liberalism. If you look at economic liberalism as well, free trade would solve everything. Yes, well, historically, free trade has tended to benefit the economic hegemon, the more technologically advanced, as you then have mature industries competing with infant industries. But as we see now, free trade is not great either. We're reinventing the language. Of course, we're threatened by Chinese car imports, the Chinese battery technologies. Everything is a threat now. So
predatory exports.
Yeah. So free trade will no longer be as appealing anymore either, as the power shifts more towards China. You will see more, much like in the 19th century under the American system, you will see less talk about free trade and more fair trade. This is the new catchphrase, because yes, sure, the Chinese can have perhaps sometimes aggressive industrial policies which give them advantage, but even if you take that away, they keep, you can make up a lot of reasons, but at the end of the day, the Chinese economy is becoming much more competitive than the American economy, which is too rent-seeking and too burdened by all of this. So what are you going to do? If you can't compete, you're going to surrender, accept that the Chinese have a more competitive economy, or will you come up with your own reasons why free trade doesn't work anymore?
I mean, they will come up with whatever kind of narrative it is. The US is sabotaging right now the World Trade Organization. All of these free trade bastions that were created by the West are now being sabotaged because it doesn't serve the purpose anymore and it's being discarded. And then you find some Chinese boogeyman in order to sell that. And this is relatively easy. The interesting thing is going to be, once not only these economies are better at producing, money, but once they have things that the West wants, and the Chinese economy is very close to that now. They're better at trains, they're better at phones, they're better at a lot of things. They're almost on par with the microchips. At some point, the Chinese are going to have things that only they have, and maybe the Russians too. And then the West Europeans are going to be, can we have that too? Because they're the ones who stifling their own innovation.
Well, that's the dilemma of economic interdependence. It's always been, do you accept dependence on a more technological advanced country? On one hand, if you do so, yes, you will be now dependent on China. But if you don't do it, you will deprive yourself of the technologies required for economic efficiency. So you're going to then accept having more backward economy. And at the moment, it seems that's where the Europeans are going, though, because the Americans told us, we have to cut ourselves off Russian energy, the cheap energy, which makes our industries competitive, and now also cut ourselves off Chinese technologies because we have to be loyal to American technologies. So you're going to see now not just having a lot less competitive economies, but we're going to be increasingly and excessively dependent on the United States. So you're going to have more economic failures in Europe. And again, I think that's why it's such a difficult time for Europe, because it's very difficult to adjust to this new time. How do you adjust? You're going to accept the rise of China now as the leading economy, or you're going to withdraw into some Cold War mentality? And that's kind of what the Americans are offering is, listen, this is back to the Cold War. Just show us your economic loyalties and we'll confront the rest. But unlike in the former Cold War, we don't have the same freedoms. We're not as economically competitive. And yes, as I pointed out in the book, it doesn't have to be anything negative. It doesn't have to, this readjustment. I even cite the final chapter, Adam Smith, because surely he's one of our heroes in the West, and he made this point. He said that the discovery of America and the East Indies, in the early 16th century, really when the Western powers began to become dominant, he called this the two greatest, most important events in mankind's history. However, so this because it's connected the world, but he also pointed out that a huge weakness of this was there was too much power concentrated in the West, and this meant that for the natives, wherever European powers went, there was huge exploitation and misery for all the places we arrived at. And this was because of the huge asymmetries. There was two big differences between the all-powerful Europeans and the places they arrived. So he argued, what would make the world better if, either the Europeans became a little bit weaker or the rest of the world a little bit stronger, simply because if there's more symmetry in power, then you can have more equal and less exploitative relations. So, this is what has come. The West hegemony has come to an end. On one hand, it can be a more fair international system. On the other hand, it's a very different role for the West, because it's 500 years of control coming to an end. How are you going to adjust to this new world?
Yeah, and we just have to hope that the rest of the world doesn't want revenge, just fairness that would save us, because things could go extremely ugly. But you point out, I must point out that you're also the author of a book that actually kind of charts the way forward, and that's Europe as the Western Peninsula of Eurasia. In European mind, that still hasn't sunk in, right? Europe still sees itself as the center, together with the United States, and everything else is built around that, which is clearly even now not the case, because at best you're like the dogs of the Americans. But the way forward would, of course, be being a European entity, and being a Eurasian entity with Europe, just one part out of many of the of Eurasia, which is tremendously huge and has tremendous potential.
Yeah, well, that's a book I published 3 years ago. It's about geoeconomic region, but that one expression, Western Peninsula of Eurasia, I said it already in the introduction that I borrowed this phrase from it was either a German paper or EU paper, and it was actually a warning, because they said, we have to assert our leading role in the world, otherwise we might end up as the Western Peninsula of Eurasia. But my so it was meant to be negative, but I was pointing out that the Europeans have more, well, it's a different world they have to adjust to, but they have more alternatives, because over the past decades, the role of Europe has been always, we're part of the collective West, and the main objective has then been to have, the Europeans cooperating through the EU to have parity with the United States. So there will be still unipolarity, one center of power, but it will be, the collective power with the EU and the US. Of course, the Americans never intended to let to have parity with the Europeans, but this has kind of been the main framework. The key problem for the Europeans is that the Americans will continue to have demand geoeconomic loyalty, and if they can't get it, they always have an incentive to use its military power. So not against the Europeans, but if you have Europeans in conflict with Russians, we have greater security dependence on the US. So what happens? The Europeans are dependent on the US, and the Europeans will help them weaken the adversary, which is the Russians. This is the same with China and India. If you can have some conflicts there, the Indians will no longer be autonomous. They will have to rely on America, while they can then weaken the Chinese. Same as Middle East, of course. Stoke conflicts between the Arabs and Iranians. The Arabs will become dependent on America. Iran will be weakened. So it's not that sophisticated. It's, divide and conquer as it's always been.
Yeah.
But my point was the Europeans will have other opportunities in multipolarity, because now they kept talking for so many years about European sovereignty, European strategic autonomy. The path to this is to diversify your economic connectivity. So establish economic ties keep them with America, but China, Russia, India, and if any country puts too much pressure on you, trying to exert too much influence over you, then you can lean towards other countries. So this is the way you assert, sovereignty or autonomy. But the Europeans now are doing the exact opposite. The Americans are telling them, cut yourself off other powers and lean on us, but then economic development will decline. We're deindustrializing, and any aspiration for autonomy, political autonomy, it goes down the drain. So it's been disappointing the past 3 years since I published that book that the EU is effectively working against the Europeans are working against their own interests. So, and I think that's quite evident now as well.
Everybody wakes up at some point, and true multipolarity will also work against the ability to do divide and conquer. Divide and conquer is possible is most possible from a position of strength. So I do believe that this will also change. But your books, this one and the other ones are part of a growing compendium of knowledge about how the world is changing and readjusting. So I encourage everybody, go online. The book again is called, where do I have it? Your book title is?
The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order.
The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Everybody go and download or go and buy a copy. Glenn, thank you very much for talking today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.